Hey everybody, Sean here with Tab Performance. Today I'm going to install the Feuling HP Plus oil pump. And if you guys like what you see, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Alright, so the oil pump and cam plate are located in the cam chest. Before we get into that, we need to clear some room, so we need to take off our bags, our mufflers, and our header, and potentially the air intake. We have a video on how to do all that, so if you're not familiar, go check that out. Once we get all that off of there, we need to alleviate spring pressure to take our push rods out. And there's a couple different ways to do that. We previously installed a Redshift 468 cam in here. When we did that, we installed some S&S quickie push rods, so that's going to make the process a lot quicker. If you haven't done that, there's a couple different ways. You can either cut your push rods out or take your tank and rocker boxes off and pull the push rods out through the top. But before we do anything with the push rods, we need to make sure that the engine is on top dead center on the compression stroke. So I'll show you how to do that here once I get the push rod covers out of the way. Alright, to get these S&S quickie push rods out of the way, all you have to do is pull down on this collar, pry up on the little metal clip, pull the clip out of the way, and that collar slides up, and then you can slide the push rod tube up, and that will reveal the lock nut. Alright, so there's a couple different ways to find top dead center on the compression stroke. No matter what you do, the first step is going to be to jack up your back tire. Once the tire is jacked up, you can go ahead and remove your spark plugs on the left hand side on the front and rear cylinder. By taking the spark plugs out, that allows you to rotate the engine over without having to fight compression. All the compression just goes right out the spark plug holes, and it makes it a lot easier to move that tire. And it'll help to put the bike in the highest gear possible. That way it's just easier to turn the bike over and get the engine in the stroke that you want it to. So once you do all that, next you're gonna use the tire to position the engine in the stroke that you want it. And I like to watch the intake push rod. So I'm gonna rotate the tire and I'm gonna watch the intake push rod go up, and that way I know the intake valve is opening. Then I'll rotate it a little bit more and watch the intake push rod go down. That's how I know that the intake valve is closing, and that's how I know that I'm on the compression stroke. Once I know I'm on the compression stroke, I'm going to go to the opposite side of the bike. And there's a couple different ways to check this, but what I like to do is I like to go to the opposite side of the bike, put something soft down into the spark plug like a zip tie, and then use the tire to rotate the piston all the way to the top, and that's how I know I'm on the top dead center on the compression stroke. Once I know I'm there, then I can go ahead and collapse my push rods. Alright, I got the push rod tubes held out of the way. Next I'm gonna use the tire to rotate the engine. I'm watching that intake push rod. It's this back one there. It's going up. There it falls back down. So there, I'm on the compression stroke. Alright, and to verify that I'm actually on the top dead center on this stroke, again I'm going to take a zip tie, put it down into the spark plug hole. I can feel it bottom out on the top of the piston. Next, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use the tire to rotate the engine. And then right there I felt the piston drop back down, so I'm just going to back it up a little bit. There we go. Alright, our last check to make sure that we actually are on top dead center on the compression stroke. On this stroke, it will be on the base circles on the cam. So being on the base circles, we won't have any valve spring pressure, so I should be able to go here and rotate the push rods easily with my fingers. And I can rotate the exhaust, go back here, and I can rotate the intakes. So I have no spring pressure right now, so I can go ahead and collapse both of these, and then I'll move on to the front one. Alright, with those push rods out, next we can go ahead and rotate the engine over to top dead center on the compression stroke on the front cylinder. We'll do the exact same process to get the front push rods out. Alright, with the push rods removed, next we're going to go ahead and remove our tappet covers. Before we take these out, make sure you have your O-rings for your push rods. Get those out of there so you don't lose them. And then these 4 bolts holding in the tappet covers are 3/16. Back all those out. Once you get your tappet covers off, next we're going to remove our anti-rotation cuffs, 3/8 socket. And the anti-rotation cuff, all it does is it makes sure the lifters don't spin inside the lifter bores. So you take that off, you can see it's got 2 flat spots. If you pull out the lifter, you can see that the lifter has 2 flat spots. So that just sits in there like that to make sure it doesn't rotate in there. Once we get the lifters and lifter covers out of the way, now we can go ahead and remove our cam chest cover. It's a 3/16. You do want to make sure you have an oil catch pan once you start loosening these, because there is oil in here. Once you get this loosened up, oil will start falling out. So just make sure you have one of those. Alright, well that's finishing up draining. We're going to go ahead and remove the cam chain tensioner. It's just these 2 bolts right here, back them out. The tensioner will come right off. These are a T27. Alright, with the cam chain tensioner removed, next we're going to remove our 2 sprockets. We'll need a sprocket locking tool to put in between the gears here, and then we'll back out this bolt. And once that one's out, we'll back out the bottom one. Alright, once you use your sprocket locking tool to break these 2 loose, this top one is a 9/16, bottom one is a 1/2. Just go ahead and back these out. You want to be aware of which spacers go where. A big thick one on top. We have a smaller bolt and a skinnier spacer on bottom. There's the 2 sprockets. Another thing to keep in mind is you will have one more spacer on the cam plate. It may get stuck All right, with the sprockets out of the way, next I'm gonna go ahead and remove the actual cam plate and the oil pump itself. I'm gonna remove it as one piece as I'm replacing the whole thing. You can remove the cam plate first and then the oil pump by taking out the cam plate bolts and the oil pump bolts, which are right here. But since I'm replacing everything, I'm gonna back everything out at once. The cam plate bolts are the ones on the outside. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We don't need to worry about the ones holding the oil pump to the cam plate. All right, with those loose and out of the way, we can go ahead and slide this whole piece out. Here's your cam plate. There's the bolts that hold the oil pump to the cam plate. There's the oil pump. We do have 2 rubber O-rings. One that goes on back inside there, and one right here. Once the oil pump is out, take the cam, remove our Redshift 468 cam by zippers. Alright, once the cam plate is out of the way, we have to do a little prep work before we can put the HP Plus by Feuling cam plate and oil pump back in. I'm just going to inspect everything, make sure everything's clean, and then we're going to apply a similar lube to the bearing up in there, and then we're going to replace the O-rings. Feuling recommends to insert them into the ports. So we have our scavenge port back there, have a new O-ring in there, and then we have our cam plate O-ring right there. Replace those, and then we'll move on to the prep work for the actual cam plate and oil pump. All right, now we'll start doing the prep work for our cam plate and oil pump. Just gonna take our oil pump gears and just start lubing them up, and then we're also gonna lube up the housings that they go in. And we have 2 sets of gears here. I have the one on this side, and they're a little bit thicker than the ones that go on the opposite side. So if you try to put the thick ones in on this side, they won't work, so you know you'll have them on the right side just as long as the gears are sitting flush with their housings. And before you do this, I should mention that it's a good idea to inspect all this, clean it out before you install it. I just use brake cleaner and compressed air to clean it all out, and then go ahead and lube everything up. Now, Feuling recommends actually attaching the fuel pump to the cam plate before installing it, and that way you'll just install everything at the same time. The oil pump's going to go onto the back of the cam plate like this. Line up your bolt holes. Then we're going to take the back piece of the oil pump. And with everything lined up, we'll take our screws. Feuling recommends using some type of assembly lube, engine oil, or some moly paste lube on the threads as opposed to Loctite, so that way it doesn't interfere with your stack up clearances. Once we have our bolts to our oil pump finger tight, we're going to take our cam, loop the cam up, and then what Feuling recommends, and this may be different than your service manual or another aftermarket company's cam plate. We're going to insert our cam into the cam plate, and then we're actually going to install this whole thing as one piece into our cam chest. Alright, next we'll lube up our crankshaft. And then before we put this in, we want to make sure our flats on our crankshaft are lined up with the flats on our oil pump. So I'm going to make both of them vertical. Alright, once they're both vertical, next we're going to just make sure everything's in place. I have my bolts finger tight, I have my camshaft in the right spot, in the right direction. The flats on my oil pump drive gears are lined up with the flats on the crankshaft. I got my O-rings back in and my cam bearing is lubed up. The tricky part here is getting your two dowels lined up. We have the one for our scavenge port, one back here. If you can reach your fingers in there and push on the oil pump and push it into the scavenge port, it should seat right in there. And then just make sure you're all lined up. Bolts are all lined up. You're sitting flush with the cam surface on the cam chest surface. Alright, once that's seated in place, next we're gonna go ahead and get our cam plate bolts finger tight. And again, same with the oil pump bolts. Feuling recommends just using some type of assembly lube or engine oil so we don't affect our stack up clearances when we're tightening everything down. So again, just get everything finger tight. Alright, with the cam plate bolts finger tight, next, just to check, we're going to rotate the engine over a couple times, making sure nothing's binding, making sure everything's running smooth or anything's catching on anything. Feels pretty good so far. So rotate it over a couple times. Then we're going to do a torque step sequence. We're going to torque each bolt down to 40 inch-pounds. Rotate the engine over just to make sure we're good. Then we're going to go to 80 inch-pounds. Rotate the engine over a couple more times to make sure we're not catching on anything again. Then finally we're going to go to 120 inch-pounds. And then we'll torque down our oil pump bolts. Alright, our tightening sequence here is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, we're going to go 40 inch-pounds to start. Alright, with all those at 40, now we're going to rotate the engine a couple times. Again, just to check we're not binding or catching. Next, we're going to go up to 80 inch-pounds. And finally 120 inch-pounds. Alright, with the cam plate bolts all tightened up, next I'm going to go ahead and tighten down the oil pump bolts. Same process, I'm going to go 40 inch-pounds, rotate the engine over several times, then tighten them to 80 inch-pounds, rotate the engine, and then finally 120 inch-pounds. Here's 80. Now 120. All right, with all those tightened down, next I'm going to wait a couple minutes, and I'm going to come back and double check my torque specs. All right, once we verified that our torque specs are correct, next we're going to do a sprocket alignment check. To do that, we're going to take our original sprocket, cam sprocket spacer, put that in place. We're going to take our cam sprocket. We got to line up the marks so we can get it to slide on there. See, it might be kind of hard to see, but there's a big tooth on the cam itself. I have to line that up with the big tooth on the sprocket. Next, we'll take our bolt. We're going to reuse the spacer. Now this bottom one's going to be a little bit different. We're going to take our sprocket, line it up with the notch on the top of the shaft. Then we're not going to reuse our thick washer for this check. We're just going to use a thinner washer, slides over, put that in place. We don't need the chain on it, so we're just doing a check to see if these are level. Then we're going to use our sprocket locking tool to torque these bolts down to 15 foot-pounds, and then we'll do our clearance check. Alright, once we got those torqued down to 15 foot-pounds each, the top one with our full-size spacer, the bottom with our smaller washer, we're going to take a straight edge, lay it across the flat surfaces of the teeth. Then we're going to take a feeler gauge and just double check that we are not out of spec. So the maximum distance we can have between these two sprockets is 0.23 millimeters or 9 thousandths. So I'm going to take my feeler gauge. I can't get that in there with my 0.23 millimeter, so I know I'm within the spec. Once we made sure we're in spec, We're gonna back both these bolts out and put our chain back on. Put the 2 sprockets off. Now we're gonna make sure our flat on our shaft is facing up. Just like that. Make sure our spacer is on our cam. Next we're gonna install our sprockets into our chain, and we're going to make sure our 2 dots are lined up. We do that by making sure our sprocket, flat part, is on the top there, and the flat part of this bigger tooth and the cam sprocket is facing up. So we'll just get everything lined up here. Have the big tooth facing up, flat spot facing up, same on my sprockets. Alright, now that our alignment marks are lined up, our sprockets are on, everything's good to go. Next we're going to go ahead and install our bolts with the correct size spacers. We're going to apply red Loctite to the threads on these. And then we're going to tighten these down to 15 foot-pounds. Back them out 1 full rotation, and then tighten them down to, top one's going to be 34 foot-pounds, bottom one's going to be 24 foot-pounds. Alright, with those in there, again, we're going to go 15 foot-pounds again. Back them out 1 full rotation each, and then tighten them down to 34 and 24. With those torqued down to spec, next we're going to install our cam chain tensioner. Inspect that, make sure it's clean. Make sure it's not worn out. Mine is good to go. Reinstall the bolts. And I do have some Loctite on these bolts as well. With our cam chain tensioner in place, these are torqued down to 100 inch-pounds. Next we're going to reinstall our lifters. The factory service manual says to reinstall the lifters with the oil hole facing the same direction you took them out. Mine were all facing the bike. Place these in there. All right, with our lifters in place, next we can reinstall our anti-rotation device. These are labeled front and rear. This one has an R on it, goes in the back. Apply some Loctite. These get torqued down to 90 to 120 inch-pounds. Okay, before I put my tappet covers back on, I'm going to find TDC. Instead of using the push rod, this time I'm going to feel my lifter. So I'm going to put my finger in the intake lifter on this rear cylinder. Instead of watching it for it to go up and down, I'm just going to feel for it. So there's going up. Now it's going back down. Now I'm on the compression stroke. And there it is. And there's a little bit of play here where neither of my tappets are going up and down. That means I'm on the base circle of the cam on this cylinder. So I'm on top dead center on this cylinder, so I'm going to go ahead and install my tappet covers, and then I'll go ahead and install the push rods. gasket and cover in place, reinstall the bolts. Doing it in a crisscross pattern, these bolts get tightened down to 132 to 156 inch-pounds. Alright, with the tappet covers in place, now I'm going to reinstall our push rods. Be sure to reinstall your O-rings in the top and the bottom. I'm going to start with our back one. Alright, now with our push rod held in place, we're going to bring our push rod down to what is called zero lash, and that's just lengthening the push rod to where there's no up and down movement in between the lifter and the rocker arm. There it is. So I got this extended all the way to where I can still spin it freely, but I have no up and down movement. All right, now that we're at zero lash, next we're gonna extend this push rod 4 turns. And by doing this, we are getting the push rod to sit in the middle of the play of our lifter. Hold the push rod in place with our 1/4 inch wrench, and then I'm going to lengthen it by making a mark on one of the flats. I'm going to extend this 4 complete rotations, and that'll put us right in the middle of our tappet travel. Once we have 4 turns, we're going to go ahead and lock that jam nut in place. All right, now that we have those at the correct length, we're gonna wait 20 minutes for our lifters to bleed down. What's actually happening here, instead of this pushing down into the lifter, it's actually opening up the valve. So we need time for the lifter to bleed down to close the valve, and then we can rotate the engine over to top dead center on this cylinder. Because if we don't, we could risk having our valves hit from them being held open. So we're gonna wait 20 minutes for the lifters to bleed down, then we'll go ahead and do this exact same process on the front cylinder. All right, final step, we're gonna reinstall our cam chest cover. We're gonna just reuse the same screws, put our gasket back on, and then we're gonna tighten these down in a certain sequence, which I'll show you here, but we're gonna do these to 90 to 120 inch-pounds. And I'm doing mine to 100 inch-pounds. double check. All right, so that's all there is to it. Once you get the cam cover back on, we're gonna reinstall our headers and our mufflers and our bags and our air intake, and then we are all set and ready to go.